air conditioning. The spiritual transformation search is really a search towards a silence, a quietening of a certain part of the mind. And so in satsang, I could say a few things here and there and leave us sitting in silence. Not an awkward silence, but a very comfortable inner silence. It's just about a matter of directing attention away from certain objects, and naturally we can rest in our own being. As many of you know, I don't do that. I talk a lot. Not because I don't think it's about silence, but because of the fact that life has designed us and conditioned us to not be in silence. And in order for that capacity to come into our life, we need to receive information. An information which ends up cutting off the thinking, sort of like an antivirus. And once that has happened regularly enough and become and a new way set in, then that part of the mind, the part that has cut off the suffering thinking, can also rest. And so what I hope is that in the satsangs, we end up leaving with something, leaving with new conditioning that becomes helpful at working on its own, at bringing in more silence. So at any point in the satsang, if you find that your head is starting to hurt because we're, let's say, trying to listen too hard and feel like we have a job to do, then feel free to just drop out of listening too hard. We don't need to get it in the way that we're so prone to wanting to get things. So to the extent that you close your eyes and move inwards, that's not a problem. What needs to be absorbed will be absorbed. So the framework that's put forward is considered. It's not random. And what we talk about here is a very specific subject. It's happiness and daily living for the human being, which happens to equate with liberation or enlightenment. Enlightenment is the end of suffering. And it turns out that happiness for the human being is not happiness through outcomes. So our idea of happiness, when we hear happiness, we sort of think of pleasurable and good feelings. And that's the problem, is that humans have been conditioned to seek happiness out there in circumstance, in pleasure, 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 pleasure. The happiness that's available to humans isn't that sort of happiness. It's happiness through peace of mind. And peace of mind is the end of suffering. Peace of mind isn't the addition of something. It's not something we gain. It's what's there when suffering falls away. And that's what we're really seeking, whether we realize it or not. Intuitively, our system understands that suffering is not natural to us. It's something that's been added on. And so there's a movement away from suffering. Suffering is an uncomfortableness with oneself, an uncomfortableness with the other. And our true nature as human beings, the core of the human being, which is obviously there all the time, because it's the core of the human being, is something that's at peace with itself, at peace with life, even when circumstance is painful. For the very simple reason that the core of the human being isn't affected by circumstance. So sure, in circumstance we might lose a toe, or be sick. People around us that we love may die. And that's going to be sad. It's going to be inconvenient. Not just, I'm talking about losing a toe in that case. Sad if someone we love dies. It's going to be physically painful, potentially, depending on the circumstance. And yet, at any point in time when this is happening, if you're lying in a hospital bed, if the capacity to turn inwards and rest in your own being is there, we find, it hasn't changed from the time I dropped into my being when I wasn't in a hospital bed, or the time I dropped into being when someone that I cared about was in my life and now they're not in my life. And when we drop into the core, we find it doesn't change. So this is why happiness for the human being is available in this life, because of what our core happens to be. If this was a different life and we were constructed differently, humans were different, and the core of the human was different, then happiness may well not be available, but it is. And a part of the human being has developed such that it covers up that core. And that's what we can call the thinking mind. The thinking mind has been grown, in a sense, developed, put in place by life. It's part of our evolutionary development as humans. That it seems by default the thinking mind gets put in place. And the thinking mind is based on false ideas, false beliefs of what the human being is. And at the core of the thinking mind are two base errors. One is what we can call the false belief in personal doership. And the second is the false belief that my completeness is to be found in outcomes. That essentially means that I know myself as that, an entity that is the doer of everything that happens through me in life, and an entity that requires X, Y, and Z in the future in order to be complete. So that is a mental self-image that is quite out of line with what the human being really is. It is what we could say, it becomes our attitude to life, based on a false idea of who we are that life put in place. So if we know ourselves in a way that is out of line with what we are, it makes sense that we're going to feel uncomfortable. Sort of like trying to put a 3-fingered glove on your hand. It's not going to fit right. And if that self-image, what Ramana referred to as the self with a small s, if that self-image falls away, what is revealed is what's actually there. what the human being really is. And Ramana's main teaching is about asking, who am I? And he talks about the self with a capital S, that which we come to know, we can know intimately. It's what we are. The self is what I refer to as the core of the human being. Our consciousness, or the consciousness functioning through this human instrument. And so given that life has put in place this false set of beliefs, the belief of personal doership and attachment to outcome, it's not really up to us to get rid of it. In fact, we find that we're not capable of getting rid of it, just like we weren't capable of putting it in place. It's a result of a process of life delivering new conditioning in each moment, and as a result of the new conditioning that life delivers in each moment, our up-to-date conditioning gets formed. So our up-to-date conditioning is a cumulative effect of all the new conditioning that life has delivered moment after moment after moment after moment. And so this started at the point of conception. At conception, the sperm and the egg come together and form an organism that starts growing, and it grows according to the genetic intelligence in that organism. So we obviously don't do the growing. And that organism grows and grows, and it's still growing. And it's always been growing. And we haven't dictated or orchestrated what we grow into. That should be very clear. At some point, the heart starts pumping, and at some point, the brain is developed enough to start functioning. Arms and legs and toes and hair and eyes all develop. It's quite mysterious and magical and amazing that life has within it an intelligence to develop something as intricate and amazing as the human being, let alone the rest of the universe that all interconnects. We're really interested in happiness for the human being in this life, so let's keep the investigation to what's relevant for happiness for the human being. And so this explanation that we come into existence as a result of the sperm and the egg meeting and then growing, and that's what we can call the genetic structure that I clearly wasn't in control of. I was a result of that. I am a result of that growth. And at the same time as the growing, there is life continually impacting that. So in the womb, there's all the fluids and interactions that happen. That's a form of conditioning. And if the baby hears music from outside, that's a form of conditioning. Everything that happens in each moment is a form of conditioning. At the point when the baby is born, we start getting conditioned on an intellectual level. We start picking up the rules of society once we get to a certain age. We're conditioned according to the location, the family that we're born into. And we're not in control of what that conditioning is. And so at any moment, the human being is a very complex biological instrument that we can say is a result of genes and up-to-date conditioning, and it functions according to its design. In each moment, it functions exactly the way it is designed, like a calculator can only function according to its design. And the human being is much more complex than a calculator, but in principle, it's an instrument. So our thoughts are a result of the programming of that instrument and the design of the instrument. The actions that happen through us, the words that happen through us, the feelings are all outputs of an instrument. An instrument that is not separate from life, never insulated from life, has spawned from life. Like everything else that emerges out of life, it's all one with life. Why is this important? It's important because when we look at human happiness, which is what we're really looking for, we find that human happiness is just the absence of suffering. The falling away of suffering. And when we look at what human suffering is in practical terms, we find that it's guilt, blame, pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes. And all of those are psychological movements of the human being. If we look at them, they're all attitudinal to life as opposed to circumstantial. Meaning guilt, blame and pride are psychological movements of mind that are looking at what has happened and relating to it attitudinally in a certain way. So we blame the other for what they did. What they did was part of the circumstance. The blaming is attitudinal. It's based on how we see that action. And so the guilt, blame and pride, which is the first half of the suffering, is all based on the deeply ingrained belief that I am a separate, independent doer. Entity that has complete volition over everything that happens through me. And on that basis, if someone hurts me, I have to see them that way, as a separate independent entity that has complete volition, and therefore they chose of their volition to hurt me. They could have, they should have done differently, is what my attitude would be if I see them that way. And therefore, if someone hurts me, I have to hate them. That's blame. And under blame, there's all sorts of different forms of blame. In its most intense form, resentment and hatred that can lead us to despise and want to kill people. There's jealousy under blame. And guilt is based on the same principle, the principle that I am this separate, independent entity, this doer in control of everything that happens through me. And so when life unfolds through me in a particular way, especially such that it is painful to myself or to the other, out of line with our preferences, then we automatically have to feel guilt and shame. I wasn't good enough. I didn't perform well enough. And so, if we are the doers, if we are separate independent entities with complete volition, then this attitude to what happens in life is accurate. And if that's the case, we need to basically accept that the end of suffering is not available. It turns out that when we investigate, we find that we're not as in control of what happens as we might originally think. And the explanation is as simple as I've put forward, is that in each moment the human being functions according to its design. It can't function differently. Looking back and saying, I should have done this, you should have done that, is based on a misunderstanding of how the actual dynamic works, how the human functioning works. If we do come to see that we really are complex instruments, then wanting ourselves to have acted differently, thinking we could have acted differently, is as ridiculous as expecting the dishwasher to produce a piece of toast. It's just not designed to do it. And we understand that, so we don't get upset when the dishwasher doesn't prepare our breakfast. Now, we can't know how we are designed. We just are in a particular moment, and our design is always changing because life is always delivering new conditioning. And that new conditioning is always affecting our up-to-date conditioning. So we know that whatever I output is a result of this very complex set of genes and up-to-date conditioning. But what is going to be output, we don't know until it happens. So Nisargadatta was asked probably many times, what will you do in this situation? He says, I don't know. It's a recognition of the fact that we can't know. We can look at our tendencies, which is what we've tended to do in certain situations, but that's no guarantee that that's what we will do in a situation in the future, because we may not be the same or anywhere near the same as we were 5 minutes before. So anyway, if we come to see that we are not the doers, at first intellectually understanding the concept, and then over a period of time investigating for ourselves, seeing whether the concept makes sense. As that understanding goes deeper and deeper, the thinking mind, the suffering that was based on the idea I am the doer, starts to be challenged. And eventually that root dissolves. But until the working mind receives new conditioning that describes this, it's quite clear looking at how humanity develops that this is not apparent to us. Because what has been put in place is the belief I am a separate independent entity in control of what happens in life, in control of what I say and what I do and how I act and how I feel. And that remains in place even with a whole lifetime of experience that when investigated we find, well, I'm not in control. I can't get rid of certain feelings that I have at will. I can't control outcomes. And so life bringing in this new conditioning that essentially describes life differently to how we see it on the surface is part of the process of life undoing the hypnosis or the error that life has put in place. So we didn't put the false belief of personal doership and attachment to outcome in place. And we don't undo it. Life undoes it by bringing in this new conditioning. An attachment to outcome, which is the other form or the other ingrained belief that becomes part of our attitude to life, means that we see ourselves as something that requires life to look a certain way in order for us to be happy and complete. And spiritual teachings are continually reminding us to turn inwards, that you're never going to find your completeness, your happiness out there. That's the error, looking for it out there. If we turn inwards, we find that we might just bump into the core of who we are and find that it doesn't actually require anything specific in order to be. It already exists. So this is very important, that this becomes a movement that we start to experience for ourselves. A stopping of the thinking mind that is continually looking outward, and a resting in our own being. that becomes self-confirming. It's then not a belief. If we don't bump into that part of ourselves, which really means a capacity to rest. So meditation is that. If we find ourselves sitting and meditating, and our meditation progresses to a certain form of meditation where there is just a slowing down, that we find we're quite capable of just sitting there and feeling like nothing needs to be done, nothing needs to change. If you can pass the microphone back, that would be great.
You talk about turning inwards and like resting in self-abidance, and I have a sensation that that's naturally happening. But then there is also like seeking that Nisargadatta was talking about, like seeking for the core. And in a way, I understand that Ramana also was talking about that seeking inwards through the question, who am I? Like you mentioned, also finding the core.
Mm-hmm.
And that is something that just happens spontaneously by self-abidance.
Actually, self-abidance is the discovery of the core. If you are abiding in I am, you have the answer to who am I. So self-abidance is the answer, is finding the core. And the self-abidance happens not because someone does self-abiding. If someone is trying to do self-abiding, that gets in the way of dropping. It's a seeking activity of the mind, which is part of the thinking mind, part of trying to control and do it. How do I do it? And so if we find ourselves seeking, at some point we'll recognize that this seeking is actually part of the problem. And when that's recognized by the working mind, like the working mind sees, even when I'm sitting in meditation, I'm asking, where is this core? What do I have to do? Am I doing it right? Who am I? Who am I? If that, at some point we'll see that that actually is what's getting in the way. Stop. And so if the working mind just says stop, then we feel a drifting and a dropping into being.
The seeking happens because Nisargadatta points to finding like the seed of existence, that he was searching inwards, and he found this seed that maybe Ramana speaks about it like located in the heart. So although self-abidance is very peaceful and there is this sense of awareness or inner space, there is still the seeking for the seed.
Because you haven't realized that you just found it. The self-abidance that you say is very peaceful is the seed that Nisargadatta is talking about. If we have an expectation in our head of finding something, we can find it and have it and then still be looking. because we think there's something more. So the spiritual teachings are filled with warnings. They have to, because on the one hand they tell you that you need to seek for it. Like, you don't have it, so seek for it. Then, because they understand that there's problems with anything that we say, they put a warning in that says, no, the seeking in itself can become a problem. So the seeking is needed to direct us in the right direction, and at some point the seeking itself has to stop. Now that's sort of, the seeking stops once we're in the right, pointing in the right direction. So what you've just said to me, where you talk about self-abidance, is abiding in I am, that Nisargadatta talks about.
I guess I understood that there is a difference between the seeking outwards and then the seeking inwards. But that within self-abidance, the seeking continues, but inwards.
Yeah, and it's the same principle, the same problematic principle. If the seeking, at some point we say that the seeking becomes, the seeking for enlightenment is the final obstacle that needs to be overcome. But in this case, in your question, I get a sense that you have an idea about what the seed is.
Sorry?
You have an idea, an expectation, an image of what the seed is that Nisargadatta is talking about. And that image, when you actually rest in your own being, doesn't match. So your being is what it is, so you're self-abiding, but because there's a expectation, an imagination of what else needs to be found, it then means that what you've actually found isn't appreciated. It's this process of looking for more again. And there's many reasons why that can happen, but this having an idea, an expectation, an interpretation, it's just because we've read, let's say, things a certain way, and the expectation gets put in place. And often what happens is we can drop into being, and it's so ordinary that given that it's described as so extraordinary sometimes, we sort of say, oh, well, this can't be it then.
It is appreciated. It is like self-loving. And what happens is there is like a recognition of that being awareness. But what happens is there is still separation. They're not seeing, they're not recognizing the self in everybody.
Mm-hmm.
There is the sense of the awareness, but not the recognition of the awareness in people, of the self in people.
Mm. So that's why in this framework we try to keep it practical and say, so what are we really looking for? Because if we approach it from the top-down angle only, we sometimes think that it might just be about oneness, an experience of oneness where the person falls away, dissolves, and we can actually think that's what enlightenment is. That when I no longer know myself as a person and all I know is the self, then that is liberation. Now those shifts happen. They are significant when they happen. They're a result of changes that are happening. But I would say we miss the point and can get sidetracked if we get lost in that esoteric movement. Because what are we really looking for in practical terms? In practical terms, we're not looking for just enlightenment, because what is enlightenment? So we need to know what is enlightenment in practical terms. And the answer that's given here is enlightenment is to continue to live as the human being, to continue to have your good points and your bad points, but to find yourself living life until it's time for death to kick in, at peace with yourself, at peace with life. And in practical terms, that peace is the end of a psychological movement that disturbs the peace. And it's always attitudinal to circumstance. This isn't different to what Ramana spoke about. He speaks about the vasanas and the quietening down of the vasanas and the samskaras. And I'm just describing the vasanas and the samskaras in terminology like guilt, blame, pride, worry, expectation, and pointing out that the reason that those vasanas arise is because there is a seed in place in the human being. And that seed is a seed of personal doership and attachment to outcome. Once the seed of personal doership is dissolved, meaning we no longer see ourselves as a separate, independent entity, the separation the separation that is a problem falls away. Because what gets seen is that I am connected to Source. That the human being is impersonal consciousness of Source, linked to a particular body-mind organism and functioning through that body-mind organism as personal consciousness. So if I awaken to the consciousness inside me, the consciousness that is functioning through this body, which really means personal consciousness, because it's functioning through this body. And the personal consciousness is what we experience of life, ourself and the momentary experience. That's the personal consciousness. In the English language, the word conscious is used in a way that can point us to a recognition of the consciousness functioning through the human being. If we are hit on the head with a baseball bat, we can lose consciousness. So when we do a little thought experiment to understand what is this consciousness, we keep hearing about consciousness. And one of the rare occasions where everyday language helps us understand what spiritual meaning is. So if we get hit on the head and we lose consciousness, what happens if we get hit on the head and it's like this? The personal consciousness experience, that which is here in this moment, is gone. Because consciousness is withdrawn. It's no longer functioning through the body. And then we regain consciousness. It all appears again. So this consciousness has always been functioning through us. It's always been the background, the basis of our daily life experience. And it's gone unnoticed. It's because it's always there. So we tend to think that it's not there. We miss it. And if we recognize what a significant component of our life experience consciousness is, i.e. it wouldn't exist without it, and we realize that this consciousness is functioning through the body, and it's the consciousness of Source functioning through this body, then when we are continually aware of our consciousness, which is always here at any point in time, we're continually aware of our connection to Source. And so if we know ourselves as the person, which person means consciousness of Source linked to a particular body-mind functioning through as personal consciousness, Now I know the other person as the same. The impersonal consciousness of Source linked to another body-mind organism functioning through that body-mind organism as personal consciousness. So this is one of the ways we can come to see the consciousness not only in ourself, but to also know that if it functions through me this way, it's functioning through the other in the same way. So we now know that what happens through me on a circumstantial basis is not my doing. It's part of the unfolding of life as a whole. That what I do in each moment is part of the destined story of life. I am an extrusion of life. I'm an instrument of life. And I'm one with life. So what happens through me is not my orchestration, but part of life. What happens through the other is the same, part of life, not their doing. I know myself as connected to Source, and therefore I see the other as connected to Source. So from this point of view, we see life is a happening. Everyone is functioning divinely, even when that divine function is cruelty. It's part of the functioning of life. An easy way of us getting past this is to see when the lion eats a baby gazelle alive, it's part of the divinity of life. It's a happening as part of life. So if our psychology stops functioning whereby we see ourselves as separate, then we start to see that we're all brothers and sisters in life, playing our role. And when someone hurts me, I see it was my destiny as part of life to be hurt, and their destiny to be the instrument through which the hurting happens. So it's not really as personal as it is when I know myself as this separate independent entity, and then I see them as a separate independent entity. And if this happens, the load of guilt and blame that we've been carrying around our whole life can fall away. So this is why I think we should ask this question, this very practical question: what am I really looking for in life? And the answer is, after many years of seeking, if you are in the flip-flopping phase and suffering comes back in, you'll be able to answer that question honestly and practically instead of philosophically. You go, who am I kidding? I just want to be happy. And what is happiness? Happiness is the end of this load of uncomfortableness with life. And sometimes it takes, we really have a habit of not being present, not seeing things as they are. We're very impressionable as human beings. And so we start believing all sorts of things about what we're looking for. Sometimes it takes us to be really real and honest and have our attention focused on something to get an answer that we say, actually, this isn't philosophy, this isn't spiritual belief. I'm answering it based on my own experience. I just want to be happy. And the happiness that I can understand is available is the ending of suffering. But I can't expect happiness to be happiness where everything is always the way I want. I can't expect happiness to be pleasure, 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 pleasure. That's unrealistic. We can look at life, it's got so many components. We're not in control of any of the components. And to expect somehow life to deliver pleasure, pleasure, pleasure to everyone is unrealistic. When we look at it, we find that our unhappiness is not actually unhappiness from pain. It might seem like it is. When we look closely, we'll find our unhappiness is always attitudinal to the pain. And it's based on this false self-image that has been put in place. This false self-image that says, what I am is X, Y, and Z, and I need A, B, C to happen in order for me to be complete. It isn't who we are. That's why then we get asked to go inward. Now, we can't go inward if we're continuing to function in a way that says, well, I'll go inward when I finish getting A, B, and C, because that's what I need. So I'll take your advice to heart. I'll get to it one day when I've finished getting A, B, and C. See, then we see that's the obstacle. The thinking that says I need to get A, B, and C in order to be complete. It's like, stop. Here I've gone inward. How do we so the question, how do we go inward? The real answer is you can't, because you're not the one that creates the stop. You're not the one that's creating the thinking. It's all happening according to your makeup. But once life has conditioned us enough to realize what the obstacle is, what the problem is, the seeking outward, once the working mind is conditioned, the working mind says stop. Not in a way that it gets into a debate with the thinking mind, just says stop. Stop and be. If the working mind never gets informed in simple, practical language about what the problem is, then there's no policeman in the environment. And the thinking mind continues to function in the way it thinks is beneficial. That's why the thinking mind is functioning that way, because it actually believes that it is an entity that requires life to be a certain way, and so it's doing everything it can to control life, including blaming the others, blaming oneself, saying you should be better, because it thinks that it is going to achieve the solution. So expectation and attachment to outcomes. That's one of the forms of suffering, based on the belief that my completeness is to be found in outcomes. And expectation and attachment to outcomes is a functioning of the brain, the thinking mind, that is continually looking outward, continually in conjunction with the belief in doership, saying, okay, this is what I need, how am I going to do it? And it just needs to be seen to be the problem. And then it starts to stop. So when you drop inwards, there is a stopping to some degree, isn't there?
Yes. The expectation is on psychological patterns falling away, because there are reactions that are even stronger than before the seeking. Mm-hmm. Like I was more politically correct in social behavior, and now it's
Is it not another attachment to outcome?
Yeah, but it just brings more separation. It brings more pain.
It does. The fact of the matter is that the flow of life is always a combination of pleasure and pain. That is the nature of the flow of life. Sometimes pleasure, sometimes pain. And our reactions, our behavior is part of the flow of life. And sometimes we are going to deliver pleasure to others, and that can be pleasurable to ourselves. Sometimes we deliver pleasure to ourselves based on the way we function. And sometimes the opposite. And to have an expectation that I become a perfect human being is, once again, expectation. It's a basis of resistance, a basis of suffering. So if I expect myself to be a perfect human being, when in fact life has designed me to be an imperfect human being, there's a gap. There is bound to be a resistance. With an expectation is essentially a belief. I need this. I need to be a perfect human being. So we are essentially creating like a snapshot of how we would like life to be and saying it needs to be that way. And then we overlay it again on top of actual life, and they're not going to match. And so if they don't match, then we have a reason to resist life because it doesn't match my expectation. So if our expectation falls away, because we realize it doesn't make sense to have expectations of life, which is this beast that is unfolding, very complex. If I have expectations of life, it's a recipe for disappointment, a recipe for judgment. And so this is why if we start to come to see the different forms of suffering, we'll realize that my expectation that I am politically correct is an imposition on your actual makeup. Can you accept your actual makeup? I think we need a rationale to accept. But once the rationale is there, the accepting starts to become obvious. It's like, I didn't create my design. I'm not in control of whether I'm politically correct or not.
Well, maybe politically correct is not the right word, but if I see the self in the other, I would be more...
Sounds like an expectation.
Yes, it is.
Seeing, the life is, on the surface level, duality, interconnected opposites. Health, disease, wealth, poverty, big, small, male, female, hot, cold. We have an expectation that life be just the good, the positive, the pleasurable. That's not the nature of life. Life is duality, interconnected opposites. If there is health, there will be disease. These are the explanations that can highlight the limited seeing of the thinking mind. Wow, why? Once we realize that the flow of life is always going to be a mix of pleasure and pain, then when pain comes, we're not surprised by it. See, yes, this is part of life. When we have an expectation that life be pleasure, 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 and pain comes, we think the universe is broken down or something. It's like, this shouldn't be like this. If you start to give yourself the freedom to be who you are, which includes the biological and psychological aspect as well as the consciousness. And that comes with an understanding, actually, I can't be different. We start off giving ourselves this freedom, and then by default we have to give it to the other. They can't be different. Now, to the identity that exists, which includes this strong attachment to outcomes, what I'm saying sounds unappealing, because it says, hang on a sec, I'm not going to give this freedom to the other to just let them be as they are. If I do that, then I'm not going to get what I think I need, which is outcomes, pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. So this description of life is actually a very big challenge to the ingrained identity. And by and large, if I was putting forward this to the average person on the street, if I paid, I'd have to pay 100 people in a supermarket or a shopping center to come and listen, they would be getting up and leaving, because it's too much of a challenge, too much of an attack on the ingrained identity. At a certain point, when an earnestness kicks in the seeking and says, actually, I am really earnest about this, then there's a receptivity, there's an openness, and certain things can sink in, can be acceptable. So the fact, what I'm suggesting is a way of seeing life objectively rather than from a invested standpoint, where we just say, actually it's true, I can't control the other. Actually it's true, if my brain wasn't designed in such a way that I have a high intellect, I'm not going to be able to do certain calculations. And so in the same way, I can't expect the other to be how I want them to be. They are how they are. This is the basis on which acceptance kicks in. Acceptance is not something we do. We don't actually accept. Acceptance is the falling away of non-acceptance. Non-acceptance is when we want someone to be a certain way, they're not, and we don't accept the way they are because we have an expectation that they are a different way. When that falls away, we find that the non-acceptance doesn't happen, and then we realize acceptance is not something that I have to work hard on doing, it's what's naturally there when non-acceptance doesn't arise. So doesn't it make sense that in order for non-acceptance to not arise, meaning the falling away of resistance, it makes sense that the basis on which the resistance or the non-acceptance used to happen needs to start to be undermined. The basis of non-acceptance is that the other could or should be the way I want them, or they could be different to the way they are. That's the basis on which resistance arises. If that was true, then it's not going to get undermined. You can't undermine something that is true. But if something is false, then you can undermine it by bringing in an opposite concept that highlights its inaccuracy. So keep this in mind next time you look at a politician and think they should be different. It's valid to discern, right, as opposed to judge. Human beings have the capacity of discernment. Now, discernment means that if someone is driving in a 40 kilometer an hour zone at 100 kilometers an hour, you see that that car is moving too fast and that it's a school zone or something like that. And so you can say that is dangerous driving. So there is a discernment that registers something relative to a certain benchmark. So relative to safety, that is, that person is driving too fast. That doesn't mean that you see them as the doer. And it doesn't mean that you don't tell them to slow down. So this discernment is different to judgment. This is very important. Is that you could see that someone, for example, eats a lot of sugar. If you spend time with them, they're always eating sugar. You can discern and say, relative to health, you eat way too much sugar. But at the same time as discerning that, if you understand that they are functioning according to their genes and up-to-date conditioning, not as a separate independent doer, then there is an empathy for the situation, an understanding. So you can discern without judgment needing to be included in the discernment.
Okay, something came in a couple of minutes ago. Let me see if I can parse it out. So there's been a seeing here that there's constant judgment here, even when it might not seem like there's judgment. It might seem like I'm liking this or enjoying this. If I check in, there's been a seeing that there's a judgment, and there is that something which can see that kind of constant judgment and feel this freedom, and feel that is what I am to a certain extent.
So there's something that feels the constant judgment.
That can see the judgment that's kind of always at the root of the dis-ease of the moment. And in that seeing, there is this knowing. But then it comes right back. And in relation, the judgment, or the subtle dis-ease. And in kind of relation to your message, if I'm clear that what I want is freedom from that, and that judgment is suffering. And if what I want is freedom from that, that's suffering. Something is free of it, but I'm not that. I'm just the constant judging. Meaning that the doer of that knowing, I can't be the doer of that.
Okay.
It's the words aren't coming out right.
Okay, if I can phrase it so it fits into this framework,
that's
it might make sense. So you find that as a person, you are partaking in a situation. That's what's always happening in life. Even when you are in pleasurable situations, you find there is still a tendency for you to be judging.
It might not be a conscious thought stream, but if I'm assessing the dis-ease as that's a way of an access point for me to witness it.
Yes. And so once you realize that that is the form of suffering that is disturbing the peace which is available, peace while enjoying something and peace while not enjoying something.
Yeah.
So if you come to notice that even when you're enjoying something, there is a subconscious tendency to be judging, which creates this discomfort, this dis-ease.
Yeah, because it's going to go,
Yes, exactly. So this concept, or this, not concept, but this topic you're bringing up in various scriptures, the unenlightened person, the seeker, or maybe not even got to the point of seeking, is referred to as a bogey, meaning enjoyer, because they are attached to outcomes. So they essentially have desires and they're continually seeking after their desires. So bogey means enjoyer. And in the same scriptures, an enlightened person is referred to as a mahaboghi, a super enjoyer. So we might scratch our head and think, that's strange. It seems like it's saying that the problem of someone who is an enjoyer, when you'd think that if you call someone a super enjoyer, which is what a mahabhogi is, the super enjoyer, that's like really unenlightened, but in fact it's being used for the enlightened person. And the reason being is that this exact thing is that when we are seeking, when we're attached to outcomes, when pleasure is here, we're not able to fully enjoy it because there is this thought, when will it end? What will happen if it ends? Could I make it more intense? And so that mental process is actually interfering with your enjoyment. And so in the case of the mahabhogi, what it's suggesting is that that attachment has fallen away. So when pleasure is delivered, it is part of life and it is enjoyed fully without this interference of it. So we go back to the fact that, okay, we see that this is in place. So we understand that this is a form of suffering. We need to understand on what basis is that happening. And the basis is attachment to outcome, the belief that I am an entity that becomes more and more when there is more and more pleasure. That I am going to be complete when there is pleasure, 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 pleasure. So automatically, we are forced to continually be seeking pleasure. And even when there's pleasure, we think, well, what if I can make it more? What will happen when it falls away? So we see it's based on this attachment to outcome. Now, the seeing, the understanding, is what I would call the working mind. Right? So conditioning of the working mind allows us to see these dynamics. Now, the working mind doesn't follow the same rules as the thinking mind. So it doesn't insist that the judgment not be there. Right? It just understands that the judgment is a happening, and it's happening. The seeing of the working mind, ironically, or counterintuitively to how we think we function, the seeing is enough. It's the beginning of the disillusion. If we follow the thinking mind says, well, judgment is happening. How do I have to stop the judgment? I shouldn't judge. Right? Now, if the thinking mind kicks in and sees the judgment and then says, I shouldn't judge, that's more judgment of the judgment. Right? So what you're saying is that you've found, or not you have found, but life has conditioned you such that now when you see the judgment, a different movement happens to the thinking mind. The thinking mind would come in and judge the judgment. And instead of the judgment falling away, the judgment would be accompanied by another layer of judgment. What you described is that you see it, and in seeing it, it falls away, but you also said that it comes back. And I guess that's the problem, is that you don't, you'd like it not to come back. So the fact it comes back means that the way you're designed at the moment is for it to be there in the first place, for it to be seen rather than judged, which is an improvement, for the initial judgment to fall away temporarily, and then for the judgment to come back. The working mind will understand what I just described, and therefore be by default accepting of the situation because it doesn't resist it. And as that understanding of non-resistance happens more and more, because it understands that it couldn't happen differently, you'll find that the initial judgment starts to be affected, because it's that same principle of wanting life to be different that is at the root of the initial judgment. Right? So as you find a non-judging of the judgment happening, in time the primary judgment will fall away, because that type of functioning that is judging is being replaced first on the outer level, where there is no judgment of the judgment, even when it comes back. There is a understanding, this is how it is. And in time, there will be an understanding, this is how life is. There's pleasure here, let me enjoy it. In the next moment, the pleasure may be intensified or it may fall away. That's life. So I will have to endure the pain if it falls away, and I'll have to enjoy more pleasure if it's intensified. It becomes an attitude of allowing, and allowing on a basis of understanding that my non-allowing has never actually controlled life. My non-allowing has just created a resistance to the life that always is.
In this teaching, are you pointing to there is no doer, or life, God, what is the doer? Or
Well, I'm saying that
Yeah.
the human being is not the doer of what happens through them. We still, on one level, will say, well, I am the one that dug the hole. You know, I dug the hole. Because on one level, yes, I physically dug the hole. But hopefully there's an underlying attitude that is also there simultaneous and says, and I dug the hole according to my genes and up-to-date conditioning and the circumstance I found myself in. So if someone comes and say, who dug the hole? You say, I dug the hole. You did a terrible job. You might say, really? Why? And they say, look, it was meant to be 2 meters deep and 1 meter wide, and you've made it 2 meters wide and 1 meter deep. So our discernment will then say, oh wow, I got it wrong. And with the deep understanding that I'm not the doer, it means, yes, I have to suffer the consequences, because society is going to judge me as the doer. Society is going to reward me for those actions that happen through me that deliver pleasure, and punish me for those actions that come through me that deliver pain. So in this case, relative to the dimensions of the whole as specified, I've delivered pain to the person who commissioned the whole. So I am going to receive pain from that person. He's going to tell me I've done a terrible job. And I can acknowledge that, wow, on that basis, yeah, I didn't do a great job, with the deep understanding that what happened was destiny. What happened was the only thing that could have happened based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning, that which are two factors I was never in control of. So when this understanding sinks in a healthy way, and as it's sinking in, sometimes there are phases where it isn't balanced. When it fits in a healthy way, we find that there's a paradox there, where we, on the one hand, act as if we are the doers. We say, yes, I dug the hole, but we also understand that I am only ever functioning according to my makeup. And so the shame for having dug the hole incorrectly. So we look at the instructions and we go, wow, yes, it does say 2 deep and 1 wide, and I did do the inverse. So I would say, the thought comes, I really wasn't paying attention or whatever, but I understand that that's a functioning of the brain. Someone might have been talking to me and distracting me. And so the shame, which says, oh, I'm such a failure, I should have done it differently, all of that, which extends horizontally in time for days and weeks and months and years sometimes, doesn't have a basis on which to arise.
So my question is, in the seeing that even in spiritual success, even in seemingly meaningful success on what would feel like the thinking mind, in kind of digesting
The working mind.
No, I'm saying the confusion of the seeking mind,
Okay, yeah.
calling the seeking mind kind of the thinking mind.
Yeah.
that movement, which feels aligned with what I would feel my human being level, creates suffering. It's all it does.
Mhm.
Even when it seems to create an awakening moment, it's just claiming something that happened,
Mhm.
and then it creates suffering around it.
Mhm. Not your doing.
And but then there is this power that is the doing of that which is meaningful, which would be freedom from suffering.
The happening. So in both cases, it's a happening. There is the happening of the thinking mind that creates suffering. It's a happening, not your doing. It's a happening according to the genes and up-to-date conditioning at that point in time, right? The judgment, let's say, the claiming stuff. It's a happening. It happens. It's a color that the artist of life has used a lot of. And then there is the other happening, the happening of the working mind that cuts off the thinking mind, let's say. Also a happening according to your genes and up-to-date conditioning. So really everything is a happening according to God's will, you could say. Everything is a happening according to life. But life functions through each of us. So we also have to sort of have the paradox. Yes, I did it, but I understand I'm not the doer of any of it. So if there is a flash of liberation or enlightenment, which is not really how, in my opinion, it happens, it tends to be a gradual process with moments of insight. When that happens, that's not your doing. That's part of destiny. But you get to enjoy the benefits. So even our attitude to life, the attitude of doership and attachment, not our doing. The attitude of the falling away, what we could call non-doership and non-attachment, understanding it's just the absence of the other attitude, also not our doing. It's all happening. Life is a happening. The confusion is where life has included in it the belief of personal doership, which doesn't create a doer, it just creates the belief that we are a doer. So like the kid driving the steering wheel at the back of the car. The kid might think he's turning the car. It's a belief, it's an attitude. Just because that belief and attitude is there hasn't made us the doer. So in life has included this belief in personal doership, which claims ownership over life, and life brings away a dissolution of that, and then life is seen as a happening. And when life is seen as a happening, naturally there's an acceptance, because the non-acceptance doesn't happen. And that's why we're told it's actually so simple, it's so effortless, and yet that needs to be qualified, because it doesn't mean it's so simple, why aren't you doing it? It's saying when it happens, it's so simple because it's just the falling away of a layer of delusion. Seeing life through a lens that doesn't allow us to see correctly, and it's just the removing of the lens. It's such a simple action. You know, we might see life all distorted and we think, wow, there's so much it's going to be so hard to figure all of this out. And when the lens is taken away, it's like, wow, nothing to figure out. It's so simple when that happens. But the lens being taken away is a happening. Coming to satsang is also a happening, and because the story of life is a story of cause and effect on the surface level, it makes sense that we have certain insights, like the insight, I simply cannot be the doer. A flash of insight happens. I simply cannot be the doer. But in life, because life is designed to be a cause and effect story, that insight doesn't just happen with no cause. So when we have that insight, there tends to be a cause. coming to satsang can be part of that causal effect. Just like, if you speak Japanese, there's a cause. You went to Japanese class. You grew up in a Japanese household. So I'm speaking English as part of the spontaneous arising in this moment, but because what this creation is a causal creation. Even after liberation, Ramana still needed to turn the kettle on if he wanted hot water.
I am not the doer is the working mind translating something into the language for the thinking mind?
I am not the doer is something that the working mind can come to be conditioned to understand. So there's a concept that says you're not the doer because whatever happens through you is a result of the complexity of the body that you weren't in control of. So that's the concept. That concept is new conditioning. It's received by the intellect. And someone can go, I understand the concept intellectually. So that now means that the working mind has been conditioned to have new conditioning, new up-to-date conditioning. And the working mind can catch the thinking mind in action. When the thinking mind is blaming the other, the working mind can look at the thought pattern and see that blame is based on, you have to investigate it for yourself based on your own experience, right? Which happens out in the world as you're living your life. And it happens not because you say, okay, between 10 and 11, I need to investigate blame, for example, because blame might not present itself in between 10 and 11. So it's when you're at the shop, ready to pay for something, and someone jumps in front of you and has a pile of stuff, and you're standing there thinking, hey, you ass, what? And blame arises, right? And then the working mind watches it, and based on its understanding, it's been equipped, it sees what the story is. I hate you, you hurt me, I hate you, essentially. You hurt me by making me wait longer. That's not in line with my preferences, so pain in the moment. I hate you for being the way you are. That's the uncomfortableness. And the working mind sees it, and what can happen, not your doing, is automatically it cuts off the blame. So automatically there is a dropping out of blame into an acceptance that this is destiny, this is life.
It came, and it seemed aligned with this, the idea that I am the thinker is kind of meaningless, and it's just kind of a made-up idea, just that there's this whole flow of life, this whole flow of memory, this whole flow of conditioning, and then that idea that somehow I can step in and control that in this moment is just kind of an insane premise.
Yes.
And it doesn't make any sense, and it creates suffering. And it seemed similar to I am not the doer, but it came, yeah.
Yeah, so what we replace the idea that I am the thinker. So if we see thought, we say, well, there's thought, there must be a thinker, and I'm the thinker. And the I that we imagine ourselves is some fictitious entity that is sort of the gatekeeper that has complete control over what thoughts arise. And that's the fiction, that there is this controlling entity that chooses what to think. The more accurate way of coming to see it is that there is this body-mind organism with a very complex brain. So genes and up-to-date conditioning basically means the whole body and the brain and how it's shaped. It's like a computer. And it sees something, it hears something, it tastes something, smells something, touches something in the environment. And that's not in our control. We're here, we don't control the environment. If a bird flies past, we are not in control of the situation, and we see something. And if it's a bird we've never seen before, or the principle applies for anything that is seen, smelt, touched, heard, or tasted, a thought arises, wow, that's an interesting bird. Now, that thought arose not because some controller created that thought, but because our makeup, which we're not in control of, so it's a machine essentially, sees something, hears something, tastes something that we're not in control of. So when we look at it this way, we see it's just a consequence of something that came before. What came before is not in my control, and the consequence of what came before, not in my control, a result of my complex makeup. And so then from this perspective, we can start to witness thoughts arising in a body-mind organism. We can witness feelings arising in a body-mind organism because the principle is the same. We find ourselves in a situation and certain feelings arise. Not my doing, but a happening. And so then life can be witnessed as a happening. In particular, not only the external things happen, like a branch falls off a tree and just physics, it's no one's doing, it's just a happening. Then we start to see, actually thinking is merely physics. Electromagnetic pulses in a neural network. That's Stephen Hawking's definition. Thinking is simply physics. And a thought arises. So we can witness thoughts arising in a body-mind organism, thoughts arising in a body-mind organism, actions arising, words arising. And from this point of view, our previous idea that if there is speaking, there must be a speaker. If there is dancing, there must be a dancer. It collapses down into just speaking happening, dancing happening. Understanding that if we want to look at a cause of the speaking, the cause is the machine, the body-mind organism. Very complex, beautiful. So this is another thing that the brain does, is if I talk about a machine, if I talk about genes and up-to-date conditioning, we sort of have our understanding of what that is, and we say, oh, that sounds very mechanical. You know, that's not life. Life is full and rich and has depth. And it does, just reducing it down to genes and up-to-date conditioning doesn't reduce the depth of life. That remains. Feelings like love and all of that is a result of the genes and up-to-date conditioning. So we're just containing or categorizing or understanding the depth of life in a new way. If you look at a relationship that fails, and they're very charged, so they're the ones where suffering often is intense, and we know it, we feel it, it's intense. And if we're lucky in time, the suffering dissipates, and usually it dissipates because we tell our story to everyone who's willing to listen, and to all those that aren't willing to listen as well. And inevitably we get advice from people, and the advice is all sorts, varied. Some of the advice, let's say, that people give even when they haven't gone through specific spiritual teachings is, for example, like, it's not about you, it's about them. They couldn't have acted differently. And slowly in time, some of those things sort of fit in, they sink in, and we start seeing the relationship, the ending of the relationship, or the situation that happened. Maybe someone cheated on someone else. We start seeing it in that light, and the suffering falls away. And so when you look at what it is in your attitude that has come in to and this new attitude to the situation that has moved it from the attitude where there was suffering to an attitude where the suffering has fallen away, you'll find that what was there initially is the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome. He did this, I hate him. Why do I hate him? Because he did this, which is pain to me, and I feel like pain is an attack on who I am. And the times that it falls away is when some concept has come in that has allowed the situation to be seen in a less personal light, seen that it's got nothing to do with me, and that the situation is maybe not as detrimental to my happiness. People say, you never know what you might find round the corner, which, is not, I'm not saying that this is brilliant advice, because it's still saying, well, your happiness will be to be found in what it comes round the corner, and it's better. But at least it takes the attention off what I have lost, and that I'm never going to be complete because this has happened. So I'm not suggesting this is it. What I'm trying to point out is that if you look at what actually brings about peace, it's always, in its different forms, of a shift from the attitude of doership and attachment to outcomes to an attitude of non-doership and non-attachment to outcome. And there's a good reason for that.
So, where would you locate the sense of the seeing, the witnessing, or even the sense of the knowingness? It sounds like sometimes you associate this with the working mind.
Mm-hmm. Well, what happens is we tend to have a simplistic view of the human being as we're going through the process. And it's good to have a simplistic view, but so awareness, we bump into awareness. Sometimes our experience shifts, and there's a recognition that actually awareness has always been here and needs to be here in order for the experience to be awared, for it to be known. And we've also then been told what we are is awareness, source is awareness, let's say. And so we think that awareness is wise. For example, awareness isn't wise. Awareness can't think. But we tend to think and attribute certain characteristics to something like awareness, that it can see something that... So awareness is the faculty of being aware, but it's the intellect that draws certain conclusions about things. And they don't ever exist independently of each other. So that's why I speak about it like that the working mind discerns certain things. But the witnessing component, when we just witness, if we're dropping into a state of being and just allowing everything to be, noticing birds flying past, people walking, and let's say there's not much thinking happening, we might think that, okay, now there's just awareness. But the fact is that awareness and the intellect are never independent. They're never not together. So even just if we're sitting back, not labeling, or just what we become aware of is the awareness function, that which is aware. And in a particular period of time, there might not be a lot of thinking. And so we think that now we're free of, there's just awareness. But the faculty of the human being includes the intellect all the time. It's always there, ready to work if it needs to. And so in a lot of situations, there's just awareness. I'm about to contradict myself. It's not just awareness. It feels like there's just awareness. Intellect is still there, and it's functioning on a very subtle level, in a way we don't realize. And then when we realize something or we have an insight, we might think the insight is awareness is insight. The insight is actually part of the human intellect. Certain insights feel very different from the functioning of the human intellect. That's why often when there is an insight, we say it has nothing to do with the intellect, because it doesn't feel like it does. Because it's the culmination of a whole lot of thinking and the intellect working ahead of time, like on a certain topic. And then at a certain point, it's like it all falls into place. And we see it. It's like, I see it. And it doesn't, in a way, it feels qualitatively different, almost as though it's not the conscious thinking, but it's still, to me, a form of intellect. You can't have that insight that just sees free of intellect.
I see. So the intellect is also something that has like it's changing. It has a quality of change. Yeah. So there is also a sense of quality. Maybe it's a sense, at least, of quality that is unchanging. Like during time, you say there's nothing around the corner, but my state of being, in a sense, my state of being, in a sense, will not change. This is the only thing that doesn't change. So, in a sense, I feel personally that it's a sense of control over reality, because this sense of being is in a sense detached from circumstances, and then you can be in control of your state of being by knowing that you have control over your attitude and your state of being. I mean, you are generating your reality. You are generating consciousness, is generating the reality through you, even without saying conditioning and genetics. It's like now momentarily reality is being generated through me. So it's me that is responsible for how I feel, like regardless of circumstances, in a sense. So in a sense, I do have control. That's my feeling, but sometimes it's hard to remember also.
So we have this in the experience. There is a feeling of free will, and that feeling of free will is a gift, because when we talk about I'm not the doer and everything is a happening and is a machine, we might overlook the fact that there is a feeling of free will in the moment that makes it feel like I am the thinker and I am the one doing this, and that's a great component in the experience. If that was taken out, we would feel like a puppet at the end of a string or a slave. And so I think what you're referring to is we have the feeling that I am the one that can choose my attitude, especially once the wiring has gone towards, let's say, the attitude of non-doership, where that's understood and you can just drop into being. It feels like I choose to drop into being rather than get involved in psychologically. But actually it's a happening based on the fact that that new channel has opened up. And until it opened up, you didn't have that capacity. Then life opened it up, and then that's what gets chosen because it's more optimal. So as we see it's more optimal, it gets chosen more and more quickly and frequently. And so ultimately we it's a precious feeling of free will that remains, but we have to see deeper down that until that channel opened up, I couldn't have chosen to go there. Yeah. So it's a paradox. The paradox is important, is I am the doer on one level. Well, who else is the doer, you know? I'm the body, and not only the body, I am the person, which includes the body and the consciousness. So on the one hand, I have to say, yes, I am the one performing the tasks, but I also have a deeper understanding that says, but I can only perform the tasks to the capacity of my body-mind organism. And so even our attitude, so in certain teachings, at the earlier point we'll say, the teaching will say, you're not in control of your circumstance, but you are in control of your attitude to the circumstance. And the reason it says that is to create a conceptual distinction between circumstance and your attitude, which at first are interwoven, and we have no sense that there is circumstance and your attitude to circumstance. So it says circumstance you're not in control of, but your attitude you are in control of. Later on in the teaching, it will say even your attitude is not in your control.
So it becomes like a natural process.
Yes, it's a happening that we understand is a happening, so we don't claim ownership, we don't become proud and say, I choose to be accepting. Why don't you choose it? I choose it, you should. We understand I became shaped by life to be able to choose it, and we can be grateful. And then when someone else is struggling and not choosing that path, we have empathy, because we realize, I was them at some point. I was shaped by life to not be able to choose that option of dropping into being. And so then we don't judge them. The alcoholic that found sobriety and then looks at the other alcoholics and say, why don't you do it, you loser. It just was that, for 10 years, he was, in that position, and then at some point something changed and he was able to choose something different. Why didn't he choose it after 1 year instead of 10 years? Because he wasn't the doer. It happened at a certain point in time. As the thinking mind gets interrupted, and at first that's what happens, is the working mind interrupts the thinking mind, and sometimes the working mind doesn't have the capacity to cut the thinking mind off, and so the next best thing is there is just a witnessing of the thinking mind happening, the suffering happening. In time, the working mind cuts off the thinking mind. It starts cutting it off quicker and quicker and quicker. And cutting off basically means silence. Until eventually, even the working mind cutting it off doesn't need to happen. And so we find ourselves still functioning, walking through life, doing what we need to do, ordering food, correcting someone. If the order comes, acceptance doesn't mean, you ordered pizza and you got salad, that you just accept and do nothing. It means you accept that in the moment, this is the outcome, and then you do whatever you can to improve the situation, knowing that the outcome's not in your control. So you ask the waiter, excuse me, I ordered pizza, I got salad. So no blame in the sense of doership. It's an understanding that this is the flow of life. Flow of life is pleasure sometimes, pain at others, and so this is pain, let's say. But acceptance doesn't mean not trying to fix it. So when the thinking mind isn't there anymore, what we have is a lot of silence, and that's why I started off at the beginning of the talk saying this really is about silence. But we're not designed to be silent. And so there needs to be a lot of descriptions in the satsang given. And hopefully those descriptions have started to become part of your up-to-date conditioning. And even if one of the significant things, like, for example, the description that says the flow of life has always been and always will be a mixture of pleasure and pain, sometimes pleasure, sometimes pain. And that is the nature of the flow of life. If just that one thing sinks in, then it makes sense that you might find yourself walking through the street, a taxi comes up or a truck comes up behind you and honks the horn really loud, pain in the moment. The thinking mind might kick in, and then the working mind says, actually the flow of life is always pleasure sometimes, pain at others. And this is a moment when pain was delivered. So that's why the talking is here to hopefully embed new conditioning that then becomes a useful tool that functions automatically, so you don't have a job to do when you leave. There's no, heavy homework. It will happen automatically based on the genes and up-to-date conditioning, which includes the up-to-date conditioning includes the content of this discussion, this talk.
Can you say that the working mind is a kind of a voice that represents what is?
Yes.
Without the personal agenda of like gaining or losing?
Exactly. And the working mind also knows that when it describes what is, it's only doing it in a sort of accurate to some extent. It knows that the working mind can never really know what is. It can, if we think about an orange, you're not actually creating the orange. So the working mind also knows its limitation, the limitation of thought.
Quote unquote objective.
Yes. Yeah. But I would say that in the working mind in context of spiritual seeking, because the working mind works in all sorts of ways. So when you're doing mathematics calculations or deciding which product to buy in the shop and reading the ingredients, that's all the functioning of the working mind. It's the functional mind. What time do I need to call the taxi to get to the airport on time? In relation to spiritual seeking and this investigation, what you said I really like is that it's the working mind is simply describing, for the sake of cutting off the thinking mind, what is. So seeing life more accurately. Thank you.